After leaving the auction, Kyle freed Ursula from her chains, telling her she was no longer a slave. She could go wherever she wanted now. Ursula, surprised by his words, hesitated. As Kyle turned to leave, she was confused about where she should go and reminded him that he had just said she belonged to him. This caught Kyle off guard. She rushed forward, grabbing his coat, and declared that she would follow him. Kyle stared at her for a moment, sighed, and told her to do as she pleased. Reflecting on the memory of how Kyle had met Ursula, he realized it was one of Kyle's memories. He figured out that Ursula had become a maid in the Marquis family because Kyle had taken her in after rescuing her from being sold as a slave, following the downfall of her family. This realization made him see how much Ursula had endured at such a young age. He also noticed that he had fully merged with Kyle, even feeling the emotions Kyle had toward her, the shared sense of abandonment and powerlessness against fate. He was snapped back to the present when he tasted the food Ursula had brought. Surprised by how good it was, he asked her if she had made it herself. Ursula, startled, rushed back in to check if something was wrong. Kyle reassured her that the food was delicious and praised her cooking skills, even requesting that she prepare it for him again in the future. Though surprised by the compliment, she agreed. Shortly after, the system showed that her affection toward him had increased to 35. He considered that, given the dramatic circumstances in which Kyle and Ursula had met, it wasn't a particularly high affection score. However, considering Kyle's past delinquent behavior, it was a miracle she had any affection for him at all. He recalled that in fantasy defense, there was no NPC named Ursula with the talent for spirit magic. This led him to believe that she must have died during the internal rebellion within the Marquis family before her abilities could develop. Determined not to let such a valuable talent go to waste, he swore that this time, things would be different. Kyle then asked Ursula if she had ever thought about learning spirit magic. She was stunned as she had never considered that she might have any talent for it. From this reaction, Kyle realized that she likely hadn't encountered spirit magic, even in her own home. Spirit magic was known to be particularly expensive to learn, something a lower-ranked noble family like hers could not afford. Kyle decided to take charge of her training and told her to start thinking about learning spirit magic. Despite her initial reluctance, he made it clear that there was no option to refuse. He approached her and explained that she needed to follow his words, as she was now his responsibility. Ursula, stunned by his seriousness, stared at him for a moment before blushing in shyness. The system indicated that her affection for him had increased to 50, and she ultimately agreed to follow his instructions. A few days later, Kyle faced off against Leonhardt when he attempted to leave his room. He demanded Leonhardt step aside as he intended to go outside. Leonhardt calmly refused, informing Kyle that he could not leave without the master's permission. Kyle's frustration boiled over and he lashed out, questioning whether he was expected to remain locked up forever. Leonhardt, remaining composed, reminded Kyle of the master's orders, asking if he had forgotten the reason for his confinement. The sharp reminder triggered a wave of fear as Kyle recalled that, due to his delinquent behavior, the Marquis of Saltarayan had confined him to his room. However, Kyle knew he didn't have much time left, and as he glanced around, he saw the mana particles floating in the air of his room. Realizing he needed to act soon, since discovering that he could open his mana channels, Kyle had been absorbing the mana in his room every day. Although it wasn't enough to open the channels all at once like it had on the first day, the mana gradually accumulated in his body, like experience points in a game. His physical condition improved over time, but it still wasn't enough to fully cure Hermimu. This meant he needed to go outside to gather more mana. Smiling, he told Leonhardt that he wasn't going far, just for a short walk to get some exercise. Leonhardt, surprised by the reasoning, remarked that it was the first time Kyle had ever given such a constructive explanation. This irritated Kyle, who demanded to know what Leonhardt took him for. Leonhardt replied that, as Kyle's bodyguard for years, it was the first time he'd heard him say anything like that. Kyle realized that his reputation had been so terrible for so long that his trust level was essentially zero. He wondered who would have thought that Leonhardt, of all people, would be such an impenetrable wall. It seemed reasoning with him was nearly impossible. Leonhardt was currently Kyle Saltirian's bodyguard, but in fantasy defense, he was a highly famous character. With excellent skills in both defense and offense, and immense potential, Leonhardt could be developed into a captain-level knight and was often used as a tank in parties. Players loved him for his loyalty trait, which ensured he would never betray them. In the original game, after the downfall of the Marquis family, Leonhardt became a wandering knight and could be recruited by the player. However, since the Second Son's rebellion hadn't happened yet, Leonhardt was still stationed at the Saltirian mansion. Kyle couldn't believe that such a talented individual was being wasted as a mere babysitter for a delinquent like him. He wondered what the Saltirian Knight Order was even doing. He then asked Leonhardt why he was still there, which surprised Leonhardt and angered him. Leonhardt seriously asked if Kyle had a problem with him being his bodyguard. Kyle panicked when he saw that Leonhardt's affection toward him dropped by 60 points. Hastily, Kyle explained that he didn't have a problem with Leonhardt personally. But he couldn't bring himself to admit that Leonhardt was too talented for such a mundane job. Leonhardt responded that he was simply following the master's orders. This made Kyle snap and realize that Leonhardt's loyalty wasn't to him, but to his father, Remton Saltirian. Kyle smirked at the thought, wondering who would want to be loyal to a delinquent like him. Still, he knew he couldn't let the situation continue as it was. He told Leonhardt that he needed to convince his father. Leonhardt noticed something different about Kyle's demeanor and Kyle smiled, thinking that once he caught Leonhardt's attention, he could win him over. He asked Leonhardt if he was right to assume that he would agree, silently thinking that his second project for recruiting talent was now Leonhardt. Leonhardt noticed something different about Kyle's attitude and asked what he was scheming. Kyle responded by asking what he meant by scheming, but he quickly realized that Leonhardt didn't trust him at all. He then explained that he had been in his room for so long that his thoughts had changed. When Leonhardt asked what he meant by that, Kyle smiled and replied that he had decided he wanted to live a long life. Leonhardt was stunned, unable to believe that Kyle, someone who had given up on everything due to his incurable hermeneutic disease, now had a desire to live longer. Months earlier, Remton had confided in Leonhardt, telling him that Kyle likely wouldn't live past the age of 20. Not only did Kyle lack magical talent, but he was also unskilled in swordsmanship. Being the youngest meant he had no chance of inheriting the family title. Despite all this, Remton insisted that Leonhardt stay by Kyle's side. Remton had asked if Leonhardt resented him for this decision. But after a brief pause, Leonhardt had replied that it was an honor beyond words for anyone in the Saltirian Knight Order to protect a direct descendant of the Marquis family, and that he would faithfully fulfill his duties. Remton, seeing Leonhardt's loyalty, explained that there was no one else in the Marquis household he trusted more to protect Kyle. He begged Leonhardt to take care of his son, and after some hesitation, Leonhardt bowed and agreed. Now, hearing Kyle speak about wanting to live longer and asking for permission to exercise outside left Leonhardt in shock. Kyle suggested that Leonhardt tell his father, confident that Remton would understand. He then asked Leonhardt if it would be acceptable for him to go outside. However, Leonhardt moved his hand to the side, blocking Kyle's path, and firmly told him that he could exercise indoors as well. Kyle, growing frustrated, scratched his head, realizing that Leonhardt was truly stubborn. Rather than continuing to ask politely, Kyle shifted his tone and ordered Leonhardt to move aside, making it clear he didn't want to repeat himself. He released a bit of his aura, knowing that he needed to go outside to gather more mana cores. Kyle stared directly into Leonhardt's eyes, letting his aura press forward. Leonhardt could feel that something was indeed different about Kyle, but even so, he couldn't back down. Leonhardt stepped closer, releasing his own powerful aura, reminding Kyle that his father's orders were absolute and applied to him as well. If Kyle truly wanted to leave, he would have to get past him. Feeling the pressure of Leonhardt's killing intent, Kyle took a step back, surprised that Leonhardt was using such force to prevent him from simply stepping outside. He realized that, had he been an ordinary 13-year-old, he might have been paralyzed with fear or even collapsed. But Kyle smiled, knowing that he was far from ordinary. He then told Leonhardt to keep his word, surprising the knight. Kyle walked up to him and lightly punched him on the shoulder before confidently walking past. Leonhardt watched as Kyle moved past him with his own aura still active, his expression calm but resolute. Turning back, Kyle asked how it felt and then pointed out to Leonhardt that he had gotten past him. Later, Kyle was outside, enjoying the refreshing air and stretching his body happily. He reflected on how long it had been since he had last stepped. As he looked around, even though it was just a garden near the annex, he felt a sense of freedom and marveled at the beauty of the night sky, wondering if it had always been that breathtaking. His excitement grew when he noticed monoparticles scattered everywhere. Overcome with enthusiasm, he rushed toward them, thinking that he would devour them all. Leonhardt stood by, watching him. He hadn't expected Kyle to be so thrilled just to be outside. And it made him realize that, after all, Kyle was still just a kid. However, Leonhardt was still in shock, recalling how Kyle had managed to walk past him earlier. It confused him, knowing that Kyle hadn't trained in mana or aura and shouldn't have been able to withstand the pressure of his killing intent. While Kyle was busy gathering mana particles, he stole a glance at the stunned Leonhardt. He figured that Leonhardt was still rattled from what had happened earlier, and he knew the knight had every reason to be. Physically, Kyle was just a 13-year-old noble boy who had never been in a real fight. But mentally, he was a veteran who had survived countless virtual wars over 10 years in the virtual reality game Fantasy Defense. The game was famous for its realistic depictions of battle, and Kyle had grown desensitized to life or death moments. Horrific sights, piles of corpses, and the feeling of being drenched in blood. So, enduring a little scare tactic like Leonhardt's killing intent was almost second nature to him. After gathering enough mana particles, Kyle thought he would be able to clear more mana channels soon. As he finished, Leonhardt approached him, stating that he would be requesting punishment from Remto. Leonhardt explained that, although he had followed Remton's orders, it was wrong for him to direct killing intent toward the one he served. Therefore, he would seek punishment. Kyle assured him that it wasn't necessary, but if Leonhardt insisted on reporting to his father, he should also mention that Kyle didn't wish for Leonhardt to be punished. True to his word, Leonhardt reported everything to Remton, who was surprised by Kyle's request. Remton asked if it was true that Kyle had actually asked for his subordinate not to be punished. Leonhardt confirmed it, stating that Kyle's words were truthful. Remton clarified that it wasn't a matter of mistrusting Leonhardt, but simply hard to believe. Leonhardt acknowledged this, admitting that even he had trouble believing it. He reported that when Kyle had calmly faced his killing intent, he had doubted what he was seeing as well. Remton pondered, trying to understand how Kyle had resisted the killing intent of a knight as skilled as Leonhardt. He then asked what Kyle did afterward in the garden. Leonhardt, after a moment of thought, recalled the cold wind and the sound of moving water as Kyle sat in the garden, focused. He responded to Remton that Kyle had meditated.